And I was testifying before the House committee, and someone said, "Why did you waste money in Sesame Street?" What do you mean waste money? Sesame Street teaches kids not to fight with each other, number one. Number two, not to hate anyone. And number three, they teach them how to read and write. Would you rather have the children in the developing world watching Al-Qaeda on television or Sesame Street? It's pretty clear to me which is better. This was our way, in a non-lethal way, of dealing with Al-Qaeda propaganda in these countries.
Hi, I'm Alex Natsios, and this is Unsung Americans, a podcast about the frontline aid workers that delivered U.S. foreign assistance and why it matters in plain English. With USAID recently dismantled, there's been confusion about what our government actually did around the world and how aid work shaped diplomacy and peace while also benefiting American interests. In this first episode, I sit down with my dad, Andrew Natsios, former USAID Administrator under President Bush. He shares stories, even a few I'd never heard before, that shed light on the impact of foreign aid. I'm excited for you to hear it. So like, subscribe, and share, especially with your skeptical friends and family. All right, welcome to the first episode of Unsung Americans, a podcast showcasing the stories of Americans serving on the front lines overseas. As a lot of people know, our foreign aid system was largely dismantled recently. So on a weekly basis, I'm going to be bringing different guests in that speak to exactly what our aid work really looked like abroad, why we did it, why it matters, but in plain English and without getting mired in all the politics that have kind of almost hidden the real work and the real value of all of this. Personally, I think Americans deserve to know the truth about what our tax dollars did to keep America safe and serve other people abroad. Today is episode 1. I'm especially proud to kick off this new series with Andrew Natsios. He ran USAID under George W. Bush, including during 9/11. He has a long career in service of our country, including as a veteran of the Gulf War and a retired Army lieutenant colonel. He also happens to be my dad. So here we are recording a public conversation for whoever wants to see it and watch it and listen to it. Not something I ever thought we'd be doing, but why don't you introduce yourself and we can get into it?
I'm Andrew Natsios, and I'm a professor of practice, they call it, at the Bush School of Government at Texas A&M University. And until Monday of next week, for 12 years, I've been the director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs. General Scowcroft was the national security advisor to the elder Bush, who started this school many years ago. He died a few years ago in his mid-90s. Before this, I taught at Georgetown University, where I went to school 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago. And then before that, of course, I was the administrator of the United States Agency for International Development for 5 years. I also served in AID, running all their humanitarian programs in conflicts, famines, war, earthquakes, disasters, under Bush 41. So I served in both Bush presidencies. I also have a career in state government as a state legislator in Massachusetts in the House of Representatives. I was chief operating officer. I ran the big dig after there was a cost overrun scandal. And I worked as a vice president in the 90s for 5 years with World Vision, the largest Christian NGO in the world. So I have a varied career, and I write a lot. I'm not a pure academic. I don't have a PhD, but I do write books and articles. We just came out with a book called Russia Under Putin, Fragile State and Revisionist Power, a set of essays. I'm the editor of it. And I'm about to come out with a book through Bloomsbury called Guns Are Not Enough, Foreign Aid in the National Interest, which is about USAID.
And for the number of times we've talked about it, that's the first time I've actually heard the title, because why would you have told me what it was called? Now, one clarification, though. Don't you technically have a PhD? Didn't Georgetown give you an honorary doctorate?
Honorary doctorate doesn't count. I have 2 honorary doctorates, one from Georgetown and one from Marquette University. But it's not really if you get an honorary PhD, you're not supposed to use it before your name. And I'm not into titles, so it's irrelevant anyway.
I don't think would you have used it even if you actually got a PhD?
No, I would.
I'll call you doctor the rest of the conversation. Well, you mentioned the book coming out soon, and I think actually a lot of the things, or some of the things we talk about today, I think there's going to be a lot more detail in the book. Um, Maybe we can just start out. What was USAID and why did it matter?
I like to say that USAID was the principal bilateral institution protecting us from the four horsemen of the apocalypse. For those of you, even if you're not a believer, the book of Revelation talks about the four, and I've modernized the term a little bit. It's pandemics, famines, war, and poverty are the modern four horsemen of the apocalypse. And that's what AID does. We are a development agency. We were a development agency and also an emergency response agency that dealt with crises around the world. And I would say it developed into one of the finest, most powerful institutions to oppose the four horsemen there is on the planet. And that's the great tragedy is we had issues before. We still had issues as of last year. Well, all human institutions are fallen, I like to say, just in the nature of humanity. And it's when I taught at Georgetown, I used to say that there were opposite things demanded of AID by the Defense Department, the State Department, the White House, uh,
Congress.
Congress interfered constantly. OMB, the management office in the State Department, in the White House, wanted us to comply with what's called the new management theory, to quantify everything, which is a big pain, and I don't think it works. I've criticized it in my book. But we have multiple masters, and that was one of the problems. And they're telling us to do opposite things. So when things didn't come out so well, sometimes it's because we're trying to please everybody, because we didn't have the position in the bureaucracy to oppose some of these conflicting demands. But the bottom line is, Alex DeWall, a friend of mine he's British, but he teaches at Tufts in Boston, and he wrote a book called Mass Starvation. At the end of it, he said there's been a dramatic drop in the number of people who die of starvation in famines since the mid-'80s. And one of the three major reasons for that is because the emergency response system catches the famines before they actually start killing people, and we stop them. The famine early warning system was started in the 1990s. I expanded it when I was aid administrator to cover much of the world. And with the exception of the North Korean famine, which was secret, no one knew what was going on. In fact,
Right.
I wrote a book about it.
Right.
Uh, there haven't been any big famines until recently. There's a famine now in Sudan. 15 million people may be dead by the end of the year. There's a famine in Afghanistan. About 2 million people are at risk, and there is mass starvation in Gaza as well. And famines are spreading because the principal means of stopping them has been destroyed. Now, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, says I've given orders to reestablish all these functions in the State Department. Well, he may give the order, but they fired all the people who know how to do this stuff. They
Correct.
had lined out the famine early warning system. They did reestablish it. It is now functioning again, thank heaven. But we know where the famines are happening right now, and we don't have DART teams, disaster assistance response teams, sent out to deal with this. I actually created the DART teams, disaster assistance response team, when I was the head of the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance 45 years ago in AID. And they matured into something much bigger than what we originally had conceived of when we created them in 1991. But
Not quite
they're
45 years
not
ago.
functioning.
You're not that old. Not quite 45 years ago, but a long time ago.
So the second thing is that it was the DART team that went into Liberia and Sierra Leone when in 2013, I think it was, or 14, the Ebola epidemic took place. And even the Europeans said, we cannot stop this. Only the Americans can do it. President Obama mobilized through AID, the DART team. We put scientists from CDC with our scientists. There are 2,500 health scientists within AID, almost all of whom were laid off when they fired all the staff.
Yeah.
And we went in with the U.S. military. The U.S. military works very closely with AID, likes AID. If you talk to most military officers who've worked in emergencies, they like working with the DART teams because they're They're action-oriented. They're very operational. They get stuff done. But we discovered what was causing the disease to spread, and we got one of the NGOs, the International Medical Corps, to do radio announcements in both countries. And interestingly enough, we went to the Christian churches and the mosques. We had the mullahs on Friday prayers and the priests and pastors on Sunday explain to people what was causing the disease to spread. And we tell them, you need to stop doing this. And the pandemic stopped. It was panicking people in the United States at a 60% mortality rate. We just destroyed that. We had a system in aid which collects data for the whole world, I mean, on the developing world, for new diseases and for mortality rates, child mortality, maternal mortality, and that data is used by the World Bank, the United Nations agencies, NGOs, the European aid agencies, and ministries of health around the world to track diseases before they get out of control. One of the things why COVID got out of control is there's no aid mission in China, nor should there be. And we didn't know this was happening, or AID would have done something about it. But my point is that whole system of reporting, which has been in existence since the Reagan administration, President Reagan's leadership at AID put it in place. I didn't realize how many people around the world rely on that system for data. It's now gone. They destroyed the whole thing.
Right. Right. And speaking to why doing this type of thing matters, I think in the case of a pandemic, I like to think it's more clear and maybe a bit more straightforward and obvious that diseases don't recognize international borders, or they don't stop because you have to take an airplane to get from whatever country to the United States, right? So
Where
there's
you
that.
stop a pandemic is at the source.
At the source,
Not when it
exactly.
reaches the border of the United States. It's too late then.
Exactly.
So one of the things I like to say is our aid program does benefit us, but it also benefits the people in the developing world. And there's no reason why it can't do both. I will go in this conversation to some of the agricultural programs we've run over the years that have benefited our farmers and our diet in the United States. They were developed for poor people in the developing world, but our farmers use the same technology. For example, we are the largest producers of a grain called sorghum. You can get it in health food stores. You won't get it. Actually, when you see 15 grain bread, a Pepperidge Farm, I think it has sorghum in it.
You can get sorghum. I mean, I cook all kinds of crazy stuff. You know that. I have a bag of sorghum in my. You can get it now. It's more
Sorghum,
commonplace. Yeah.
had a big problem because there was a thing called witchweed. That's the common word for it. It's called striga technically, and it was destroying the sorghum crop across the world, particularly in Africa and Latin America. And AID had just subsidized the PhD of an Ethiopian scientist who's a plant breeder. He went to Sudan, developed a striga-resistant sorghum variety. He then came to the United States, became an American citizen. He still teaches at Purdue. He won the World Food Prize. He's a hero. It was very interesting. We had a group some years ago of ranchers from Texas who came in and thanked AID for developing the sorghum variety, which they use to feed their cattle. So when you eat beef in the United States, you are eating AID beef. Why is that? Because we developed this sorghum variety, and we use this to feed our pigs, our cattle in the United States. I was in southern Texas doing a study on Hurricane Harvey, and I noticed all of this. It looked like sorghum. So I stopped to talk to one of the farmers, and I said, "Is this sorghum?" They said, "Yeah, it is." In Africa, they call it Reagan sorghum because it came out when President Reagan was, and they give the United States credit for it. But it's grown everywhere now because it's resistant to striga. Now, it wasn't bred for ranchers in Texas, but the seed is a public, anybody can get the seed. It's not owned by any seed company. The same thing happened with wheat. 60% of the wheat grown in the United States comes from what's called the CIMMYT Research Center in Mexico. They have been devastated because they wiped out all the research money in AID. 50% of their budget came from AID. 60% of our wheat is a fungus-resistant wheat. It was developed for the developing world, the seed, but our farmers use it now because it protects our wheat crop from this fungus. So
We're
when
not
you
so
eat when
disconnected.
you eat bread in the United States, you're
Yeah,
eating AID. Now,
yeah, I
the
do.
Gates Foundation gave money for it too, and I think USDA gave some, but AID was a major funder of the system of labs around the world that breed. And this is not a GMO. None of this is GMO for people. I'm supportive of GMO, but some
Right.
people don't like
But
it.
for what it's worth, it's not.
Right.
Right. And then when you see this, you hear this type of thing and you realize the interconnectivity between
There's
countries,
another
among
thing that
countries.
I would
Why
mention
would
to
you
you.
not, why would you
Right.
not want that? What's
Right.
wrong with that? Right.
So tilapia, the fish, it's the second or third most eaten fish in the world. And it produces billions of dollars in revenue for people around the world who cultivate it. Comes from the
Including in the
Nile
United
River.
States, including
Pardon
in
me?
the United States. Tilapia is farm raised in the United States too.
That's right.
It's including
That's
in the
right.
United States. Yeah.
So it comes from the Nile River. We actually have Egyptian hieroglyphics with the tilapia, and interesting. It was brought to Hawaii in the 1950s as a bait fish. AID then in the 60s said, you know, we could increase the protein in people's diets by commercializing this. And so we worked in the Philippines with one of these breeding centers that I mentioned earlier, CIMID in Mexico. There's one for fish farming in the Philippines. And we developed the supply chains for the commercial export through private markets of tilapia. So when you eat tilapia, the reason it's on your plate is because AID developed a commercialized system 50 years ago that's been highly successful in getting this out. We did it for the developing world, but again, it's now in our diet and other countries' diets of wealthy countries.
Right. Right. So let me move on to something that's, what's happened more recently. Um, I think obviously, as you remember, when this all started in early February, when the dismantling of USAID started, and Elon Musk put it in the wood chipper, as he seemed to enjoy saying, uh, and a lot's come out in the last few months now since then about his complete lack of understanding of what USA did, what the damage that he was causing and would cause, all that, and how
The thing that
totally
annoys me the
careless he was.
most, uh,
Yeah.
Will Rogers, the great humorist from the Midwest in the 20s and 30s, said the most dangerous thing is an expert off his subject. Sometimes very smart people in one area think they're smart in every area, and they're not. He didn't know anything about what AID did. AID introduced the internet to 26 countries in Africa. In fact, I called in the senior guy at AID who was an expert in this. And I said, if I gave you $15 million, can you get the internet to 26 African countries that there's no internet? And we put the physical infrastructure, the giant disk to download the World Wide Web. We put the laws, we proposed the laws to these countries so there'd be competitive bidding, honest competitive bidding for which providers would come in. And now the internet's at 26 countries when there wasn't any at all before. That's a high-tech thing. If they knew anything about what AID did, they'd realize that AID has had a lot to do. We had a lot to do with the expansion of cell phone technologies in developing countries.
And
I
actually,
remember Ethiopia.
even recently, Microsoft was part of a co-investment partnership with USAID,
That's exactly right.
and it was through the company I worked for actually for a while that expanded broadband internet access in rural Africa. And the reason the partnership was not just sort of a win-win, but win-win-win, is because Microsoft had invested money in it. So this was not portion of this was not taxpayer money. It was Microsoft kind of paying their portion, but they wanted the partnership with USAID and then its partners and contractors and all of the networks on the ground. So to your point, so they could actually make this happen and they could actually implement it on the ground, right?
Well, another story is I met with the CEO of a big high tech, I think it was Cisco Systems, as I recall. This was about 2003, I think it was. And they were going to put $200 million into building internet cafes all over sub-Saharan Africa. And we were going to put $3 million into the same project. And I said, why? We're not going to give you $3 million. It was actually the AID missions that were helping, and we quantified how much that was worth. I said, what do you care about? He said, well, we're going to countries. We don't know anybody in these countries. Who should we talk to?
Exactly.
How do the laws work? Because AID helped write a lot of these laws. And I said, why do you want us? He said, because you've been there for years. You know which ministers are really interested, which ministers are corrupted that we should not deal with, how to get the permits that we need. And then I had another CEO complain from another high-tech company. And he said, well, are you helping them? I said, I'll help you too if you agree to invest $200 million in internet cafes and sub-Saharan or anywhere else in the developing world. And I said, do you intend to do that? He said, no. I said, well, then don't come to see me. They have a marketing strategy. We'll help any American company that wants to do this, as long as it's very clear what their motivation is. It's open to every other company. As I told you, I've told you many times, one of the things that's most important that I started was the Global Development Alliance, which is public-private partnerships. And this effort with Microsoft is
Exactly.
EA,
That's exactly what it was. Yep.
and so was this thing with I think it was Cisco Systems, as I recall. But are these things in the interest of the United States? Of course they are. They're in the interest of our businesses, but they're also in the interest of those internet cafes in Africa help train people and educate Africans as to how the internet works and how technology works. They're kind of schools in this in technology. The people complain the Chinese are beating us. Well, I mean, if they gave AID more money to do GDAs, maybe they wouldn't be beating us. And now
Well,
that we've
exactly.
abolished AID, we were helping our companies be more competitive.
And to that point, there's a notion that a lot of these projects or that USAID funding were some kind of charity handout. When if you have a major multinational corporate like Microsoft, Google, Chevron, I know for a fact Chevron, Microsoft, PepsiCo, these are companies that have invested millions of dollars in these types of partnerships with USAID. And by the way, to be clear, it was not USAID hiring Microsoft and giving them a contract that was paid for with taxpayer funds. This was Microsoft investing its own capital in the millions because it was in their business interest, right?
Yes.
So if USAID was doing
what we
like
do
that,
is we design the project, we find the implementer, and we jointly fund. We don't give them money, they don't give us money. We jointly fund the project. Then AID manages it to make sure it's worked properly.
Exactly. And the idea that the mentality is some kind of charity handout is wrong. Why would a private company put that much money into something? They're not interested in charity, right? Not that they're doing suggesting that they're doing anything wrong or should be, but that's not why they do things. They have a bottom line that is their priority, right? So it's the private sector actually saying, that's them saying, this is a worthy business endeavor. That's why I'm going to invest so much money in it. And I'm going to gain something from it by gaining new internet customers, for example, or users, right? In the case of Microsoft, right? Now let me move on to a question sort of related to all this and going back to how carelessly and cruelly this was all done over the last few months by Elon Musk and then others. It's not just Elon Musk, right? At the very beginning of this in early February, I called you and asked you if you wanted to engage in the fight, speak out publicly. And you said to me, I'm 75 years old. I don't have the energy to do this anymore. And I understand. I think that was the end of it. And the next morning, this is 8:00 at night. And the next morning you called me with a completely different tone and said, all right, let's fight. Let's do it. Something along those lines. And that's something you would say, by the way. So I think that's what it was. Why defend USAID? And beyond the obvious, because a lot of other people could be defending USAID right now, and they're choosing not to, right? I can understand some of that where people feel like they're going to get threatened. That's a real risk. So why do it?
Well, one is some of the things they destroyed were things I created. And I have to say, from an ego standpoint, I was furious with that. But two, I know what AID does and how it protects the American people, including my granddaughters, your children. And I was just furious with it. My great uncle, his name was Demetrius Kardimas, died of starvation during the Greek famine of 1942-43 when the Nazis stripped Greece of food to feed Rommel's army in North Africa. There are mass graves all over Greece. 300,000 or 400,000 people starved to death. And my father used to tell us that story over and over and over again when I was growing up. So when famines take place, I take it very personally. And so I told all the AID mission directors, if there's a famine in your country and you haven't told us about it so we can stop it, I'm going to hold you personally responsible. Even though you didn't start it, I'm going to hold you responsible. So we'd get cables in at the slightest hint that there were what we call pre-famine indicators, and we would send teams out to make sure. So there was a dramatic drop in the number of famine deaths. Ask Alex Natsios, as one of the leading scholars of famine. He says it in his books. AID led the way, and it was AID teams. And he and I were the ones that went after the administration when they canceled the famine early warning system. So does that make a difference to me? Yes, it does. And does it make a difference to the American people? I'll tell you why it counts. One is people in the developing world would say, here, the Americans are finally here. We were dying and they saved us. That's not a bad thing. President Bush, when they closed AID, we had President Bush 43 and President Obama say goodbye and thank the career people virtually, on the internet. And he said, we saved 26 million people's lives through the HIV/AIDS PEPFAR program that President Bush started. 26 million people. He said, don't you think it's in the national interest of the United States to save 26 million people's lives? They did a study not funded by AID, was actually by the Spanish government and some NGOs in Europe, not in the United States, to see the effect of AID health programs and disaster relief programs between 2001 and 2021. This is scientific research by scientists. They concluded that AID had saved 92 million people's lives and that 16 million people would be dead by 2030 because of the destruction of all these programs. Well, I'll tell you what happens in a famine. When people get panicked that there's no food left, they start moving en masse. Millions of people. And if famines start again, there's going to be pressure on our borders and on the European borders because people are going to leave their countries looking for food. That is not in our interest, and it's not in the people's interest in those countries. But I do it personally for moral reasons. Other people don't care about the morality of it. We should care from a national interest standpoint to stop these catastrophes before they happen.
And why would you not want to make friends where possible and within reason? I'm not saying everyone should be our friend. I don't want every person to be my friend, right? But where reasonable in a developing country, where the risk of instability and extremism, terrorist cells, things like that, why would you not want to have friends there? Why would we not want to have friends in places like that?
Well, let me tell you,
our allies. And actually, that reminds me of one of the things that this ridiculous criticism, and they tried to sort of make it, trivialize the work that USAID did in partnership with Sesame Street. It's a long time ago, but I think that was under your watch, or that was when you were at USAID.
I signed the order, and I was testifying before the House committee, and someone said, why did you waste money in Sesame Street? What do you mean waste money? Sesame Street teaches kids not to fight with each other, number one. Number two, not to hate anyone. And number three, they teach them how to read and write. So we started Sesame Street in Iraq, in Pakistan, in Bosnia, and in Egypt. I signed the orders in Egypt to put a Coptic Christian puppet in Sesame Street. The surveys we did showed that 98% of Egyptian women, rich and poor, middle class, watch Sesame Street with their kids. There's a lot of discrimination against Coptic Christians because Egypt was a Christian country before the Prophet Muhammad was born. And there's still a Coptic church. There's 7% of the population still Copts. I think it's actually higher than that in reality. But there's a lot of discrimination, not by the Egyptian government, because they put senior people. The foreign minister was a Coptic Christian some years ago. Boutros Ghali became Secretary General of the UN. But there's a lot of, they will kidnap Coptic children when they're born and bring them from Muslim households. I'm outraged by it. I saw the leader of the Coptic church, Pope Shenouda, when I was there 25 years ago. We put a puppet in to deal with that issue of discrimination in the Sesame Street. 25% of the Sesame programming was paid for by AID in Egypt. 75% was paid by Sesame Street. I think that's a good deal. But more importantly, would you rather have the children in the developing world watching Al-Qaeda on television or Sesame Street? It's pretty clear to me which is better. This was our way, in a non-lethal way, of dealing with Al-Qaeda propaganda in these countries, because it's very real.
It was very
and
real.
We
and
were
look what it led
criticized
to.
for it. I couldn't believe anybody would criticize for Sesame Street, but they were attacking us as a waste of taxpayer money. It's not a waste of taxpayers' money. It's a good use of the money.
And actually, that was one of those things where when we were talking to people in early February, I remember going to senior people who'd been doing international development, were doing foreign aid work, who said, what are they going after that for? Like, what's wrong with that? That was a good idea. You know, even people who hadn't been involved in it sort of instinctively knew that doing something like this is how you actually attack problems at the source, right?
You know, the studies have been done as to who joins these radical Islamists and other kinds of militias that go around killing people all in the developing world. Almost all the young men that join are illiterate, who have no job prospects. If you want to get married in developing, you got to have a job, because there's a thing called the bride price. No bride price, you can't pay for your bride, you don't get married. And Professor Valerie Hudson here at the Bush School is one of the leading authorities in this problem. Well, guess what education does? It gives young men job prospects. Don't you want them in school instead of joining these militias? It's in our interest not to give them an incentive to join extremist groups.
Well, and just like in the United States, it's not a developing country phenomenon. The marriage piece, and fine, but beyond that, the worst thing anywhere in the world you can have is a bunch of young men with no jobs, nothing to do, and nothing to lose. We all know what that leads to. That's a problem in the United States in some places. It's a human problem, right?
You were born in Massachusetts, where I was brought up, and I served as I told you, in the House of Representatives in Boston. And the Puritans used to say, an idle mind is the devil's workshop. I repeat that a lot. Some people who aren't believers get upset when I say it, but it's absolutely true.
And I don't know where
that's why the first law in the country requiring in the 1830s that every kid had to go to school was in Massachusetts, because of the Puritans.
The one I don't know where this is from, but the devil dreams on an idle horse is almost the same, or it is the same. It is the same thing. So the connection back to New England, even though I didn't grow up there, we would go up there growing up all the time. You grew up there, obviously. Let me shift gears, because you sort of made me think of something about, growing up around your stories, right? So when I was in middle school or high school, I can't remember. I was younger, not out of the house. We were in Maine at the Church of God. That we would go to Maine every summer, and we'd go to this small, really nice little church on the island in Maine that I know you still go to every summer, the Church of God. And Pastor Joy was giving a sermon about the hand of God saving people, something around that theme. And he told us, he's a lobster fisherman and a pastor, right? That Pastor Joy. And he was telling the story about being on his lobster boat and getting caught in a nasty storm and nearly falling backwards off the boat, and him recounting that something actually pushed him back in the boat that was unexplainable. And for him, it was literally the hand of God saving him. He said, does anyone else, it's a small room, right? The small church is small, really small town. He said, does anyone else have any stories? And you told a story. And see, I'm going to remember this. A young guy's going to remember something like this. You told the story about being in a tiny airplane getting shot at in the midst of a civil war in East Africa somewhere. I don't remember where this. You're going to remember this, I think. I hope. You've been shot at a lot of times, but uh, and the plane kind of corkscrewing to avoid the bullets, avoid getting hit, but also the pilot seemingly losing control of the ship or of the aircraft and what happened. Can you just recount that here, just to kind of give people a sense of, um, the what these things can really look like in some of the worst places in the world where our people have risked their lives, Americans have risked their lives in service of other people and the United States interests.
We actually had a wall in AID. I, as the administrator, we put plaques up for all the 108 officers who've been murdered over the years in civil wars and conflicts as a memorial for them. And that we were very worried they're going to destroy that when they shut AID down, but they moved that to the State Department. They're looking for a place to put it up there. But I got shot at a whole bunch of times. One, I was in Sarajevo during the Bosnian Civil War, and I was with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Larry Hollingsworth, who's very famous actually, and he was a special forces in the British military and retired and worked to work with refugees and displaced people during wars. And I was in his car. Thank heaven, it was had been armored. It was a Land Rover, I think. And we were going between the Serbian and Bosnian lines, and I thought people were throwing stones at us. And he said, "Get on the floor, Andrew. We're being shot at." I said, "What do you mean shot? Those are stones." He said, "They're not stones, they're bullets. And if it's the right kind of bullet, it's going to go right through the glass." So we went from 5 miles an hour to 50 miles an hour very quickly. And we were fine. No one got killed. The story you're telling, there are actually two stories from East Africa. One is we were in Asmara, the capital of Eritrea, during the Ethiopian Civil War. This was in 1990. And a famine was starting, and I went in to see how we could get food across conflict lines. And I think it was with Bill Garbling. Bill Garbling just died of a heart attack last week. He was the senior humanitarian emergency officer and aide and very close friend of mine. He was with me, and I remember we got on the plane, and I saw all these puffs of smoke around the plane, and I said, "Is there a storm or something?" He said, "No, those are mortar. They're mortaring the plane, Andrew. We need to get out. Tell the pilot to leave immediately. They're going to get blown up." And so we literally left the airport just in time before the plane got blown up. Another story was when a small plane is landing in the middle of a conflict and they're shooting at it, they do what's called corkscrewing. They, instead of flying straight through, they will go from a very high height where the bullets or the artillery can't hit it. And they do a corkscrew like this. And we went in the southern Sudan during the Civil War. We landed. I can't remember. It may have been Rank. I can't remember the city or the town that we landed in, but it was a dusty airport. It was not a finished airport at all. It was one little mud hut for but we made it through, but we were being shot at. And the pilot said, "You need to hold on. If we get hit, it'll blow up immediately. You won't even remember it." I said, "No, because we'll all be dead." We didn't make it. And it's very interesting. That was also in 1990. And later I had a hand in with American diplomats in ending the Sudan Civil War between the North and the South, which had been going. 2.5 million people died in that Civil War. And later, when I left AID to teach at Georgetown, President Bush uh, appointed me as the U.S. envoy to Sudan to help implement the peace agreement that he helped negotiate. In fact, one of the reasons he told me that he chose me to be the administrator of aid is because I was friends with the commander of the Southern Rebel Army in South Sudan who negotiated the peace settlement, John Garang, who I had known before. And interestingly enough, John Garang went to high school in Iowa. He went to college, and then he got his PhD in agricultural economics at Iowa State. So he's a very big fan of the United States, very pro-American, one of our allies. And I had a hand in the negotiations that
I
ended the
remember.
Civil War, where and at the independence ceremony, because the South voted to secede and the North, we put a lot of pressure on the North to let them secede without a war. And at this after the ceremony, there was a big luncheon, and the president of South Sudan, Salva Kiir, came up to me and he said they tried to exterminate all of us by starving us, and AID and the U.S. saved us, or we wouldn't all be here right now. I'll never forget him saying that.
I remember him sitting in our living room and
Yes, he came to dinner at our
right outside of
house.
DC. Yeah, all of them. Yeah. Um, why did you keep going back to places you were getting shot at, by the way?
Well, there are a lot of people dying, and I came to love the Southern Sudanese. I found the tribal traditions very beautiful. Unfortunately, tribalism can also be a curse. It's a very beautiful thing, but also a curse when political leaders use tribal hatreds to mobilize their supporters, and that's what's unfortunately happened in Sudan. The big, interestingly enough, the the famine now is in the north, not the south, because the north has collapsed because there's a civil war between two factions in the Muslim part of the country, which is in the north, which is an independent country. They're two different countries now.
Right. Um, right. So let me let me ask something, and um I have my opinions on this, and we'd probably share them, frankly. But why was it so? Why it seemed like it was too easy for USAID to be dismantled. Um, and I think this is something because you had been working on this book before all these terrible things happened the last 7 months. But you had to add quite a bit and really dig in to figure out what actually happened here. There's a lot of people writing their articles about I understand what happened and this needed to be reformed, etc. But what do you think? What allowed for that to happen? Why was it too easy?
Well, it was easy because they violated federal law. I mean, AID exists in law. They have no authority without the Congress repealing the law, which Congress would never have done. There's a lot of support for AID among the Republicans, particularly in the Senate.
There always has been.
Yes, always has been. And if they ever had a vote, AID would have continued. So, but I think what the three ways that the supporters of aid would normally have tried to stop what happened is through the court system, and then the second way is through the news media, and then the third way is through the Congress. And the administration succeeded in neutralizing all of those, not just for AID. They laid off 145,000 federal employees. 10,000 of them were at AID. It was a very tiny percentage. But what they claimed is that they were dealing with a budget deficit, which is massive. The debt is now 6 or 7% of GDP of the country. This is debt service. And in my view, it's extremely dangerous. If this continues, it's going to be catastrophic. The debt levels are $37 trillion, not billion, $1 trillion. It's difficult to conceptualize this. If this continues, we will destroy the economy of the United States and then the world. We're on the edge now of a major financial catastrophe. Said, I'm going to deal with this. Well, he himself admitted, of a $6.7 trillion budget, he cut about $150 billion. That's all. It doesn't deal with a budget deficit. The budget deficit is mostly what are called entitlement programs. They're Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, supplemental security income, rent subsidies. They're programs that benefit the welfare state, okay? I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm simply telling you that's 75% of the budget, along with the debt, which is not an entitlement program, but it's a required payment we have to make. AID is 1% of that.
Less than 1%.
Yes,
It was
less than
less than
1%.
1%.
Actually, it's 0.75%. Now, I argue, and I'm a conservative, I'm not on the left. I believe that the three major functions of the federal government are defending the country through the U.S. military, representing us abroad through embassies, through the State Department. AID is part of that system. It's it's our relationship with the rest of the world, is in the Constitution. The third is the courts, federal court system, to protect property rights and that we resolve disputes peacefully. Many countries don't have a functioning court system, and that's why they have civil wars. These other things have been added over the years. Some of them good, some of them, I think, frankly, the welfare state is beyond what we can afford at this point, and we should be having a bipartisan discussion as to how to do this. And there was an effort about 15 years ago to deal with this problem, and we didn't solve it. There was a proposal to do it, and we couldn't get the two parties to agree to it. The only way this is going to get fixed if the two parties work together, because as soon as the Republicans lose, because they will lose control at some point, and Democrats will take over, they're going to rescind all the things the Republicans did. You've got to get bipartisan support to deal with it. Yeah. But doing away with AIT it's not going to deal with a budget deficit. It's ridiculous. It's a tiny little percentage of the budget. And so is the State Department. The Defense Department is about 13% of the budget. So I think that's one of the big issues. The second issue is that Elon Musk was testing a methodology for going around shutting down federal agencies. AID was simply the first one because the effect politically was negligible. And the reason is the people who are suffering because AID is shut down, they're on the other side of the world. They don't vote. They don't talk to pollsters. They don't talk to the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or Fox.
They're not directly connected to Americans in an obvious way.
And people don't know the effect of this around the world. I can tell you the effect because I've talked to some of the people, and there's mass panic. But they tested this methodology, and then they used it in other federal agencies to shut down. You know, the thing that's disturbing, what are the agencies they shut down? They massively cut the U.S. Geological Survey that tracks earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. It's a tiny little agency. Why did they do that? The National Weather Service? We need to know if a hurricane's coming. They damaged that. They're scientists. AID is principally scientists. And to fire all these people, well, what's the purpose of that? It's not going to deal with the budget deficit, but that's
private sector. It's not like the private sector. It's not a critique. It's not a criticism of the free market. I'm
right.
Quite a big proponent of the free market and private industry. They're not going to. Why would the private sector step in to fill the void in these things, which is critical?
I've listened to some of the Doge people, the Musk people. We're going to have private industry do this. I said, we've been having private industry as partners for 25 years. Where the hell have you been? Okay, they did not know what the GDA was. They never heard of it before. And that's what really infuriated me. They didn't even bother to look to see how we did our business, because the GDA now has raised $60 billion in private sector money for AID projects from American corporations and foundations.
And we were $60 billion. And again, to be absolutely clear, that is not taxpayer money that USAID paid private contract, because USAID contracted out a lot of the work for actually many of the guests I'll have on this podcast after this going forward, the people who are closest to the frontline work were often international NGO workers, employees of private contractors, who, by the way, would have to manage and deal with fraud, security, major challenges on the ground all the time, and who, if something was fraudulent or there was a fraudulent cost incurred, they're the ones that would eat the cost, right?
Yeah, the way the system works. The way the system works is if you take a grant or from AID, if you're an international NGO or a university, we give millions of dollars to universities to do work abroad, or contractors. If there's fraud against your program, you have to absorb the cost.
You absorb the cost, exactly. Exactly. And this is the side of the work, the side of the kind of part of the whole infrastructure that I worked in, and I had to manage this to deal with it myself all the time for 20 years, right? I know exactly how it works. We ate the cost, right? Private companies ate the cost. But in any case, it's not that the $60 billion the private sector invested through partnerships with USAID was taxpayer money. That was private company money, right?
That's right.
That was their money that they invested. Co-invested, exactly. Yeah. So that actually reminds me, recently, Jeremy Lewin, who's the young guy who had no aid experience coming into all of this, who was brought in while USAID was being dismantled. Um, he was interviewed on a podcast with the New York Times, and they asked him um, something along the lines of, where do you see, what should our aid program and kind of vision and strategy look like, and what would the impact be in 20 years if you were looking ahead? What would you want the impact to be? And he said something along the lines of, trade with more trade with U.S. companies, more investment by U.S. companies, et cetera. Essentially, economic development. And I looked into that myself because I heard this. I know quite a bit about a lot of the economic growth projects that USAID did, right? I've worked on several of them. Um, in 2019, the economic growth portfolio of the amount of money that USAID spent on economic development was $3.8 billion, I believe it was. In 2019, or up to 2023, it was $20.9 billion. So 15, what is that? $16 billion increase in 4 years on economic development programs, which, by the way, from having worked on those projects, the way that they operated was they brought in private sector expertise to work on the project as consultants, as staff. They created all these partnerships with private companies, and usually they were American companies. In fact, we were often required to prioritize working with American companies and to strengthen access, increase access and open up markets for American business abroad. And in many cases, once again, these were win-win partnerships, win-win investments. They were free. They were market driven. A private company wouldn't engage in something like, they wouldn't even waste their time with an activity with USAID if they didn't think there was any market value in it, right? So I heard him saying that, and it's almost shocking to hear that he said, "Oh yeah, we destroyed all this, and this is what it should look like." Well, if that's what should, either he had no idea what the work was, which is alarming, or he's being completely disingenuous. I don't really know what's worse, but I suppose that's less of a question and more just a point that I don't think there's been that much out there anywhere in the media about the amount of kind of access to markets and economic development that benefited the American private sector and large American companies, right?
Well, I'll just tell you a story. There's a professor at the Harvard Business School, Michael Porter, who's very famous as an expert in competitiveness. Why are some countries more competitive than others? Why are certain industries more competitive? And he wrote this 1,000-page book on it. I used to give it out to heads of state in the developing world, and we had programs to implement to improve the competitiveness of these countries. And when the Massachusetts economy collapsed, without going into a lot of detail, 1990, Bill Weld was elected a Republican governor, a moderate Republican governor, and he appointed Michael Porter to chair a commission on rebuilding the Massachusetts economy. By the way, it's one of the strongest economies in the country because of the reforms of Michael Porter. We brought him into AID, and we videotaped a 2-hour lecture he gave to the senior staff while I was the aid administrator, and I sent the video out all over the world, and I said, you need to watch this to see if we can start implementing some of his theories practically. And we had heads of state asking, we want these reforms, please help us. And that's what we would do. We've been doing this for a long time. I have to say, I think Jeremy Lewin went to Harvard Law School. The interesting thing, he was an aide to Lawrence Tribe, one of the most liberal legal scholars in the country. He was research assistant. What is he doing working in the Trump administration if he worked for Lawrence Tribe? He's 27 years old. He's running what's left of our aid program. But some of the things he said in that interview were so stupid, it was infuriating to me. AID has had clean audits for 8 years. You know The Pentagon has not had one single clean audit in 8 years. And I'm pro-military. I'm not anti-military. But they can't get clean audits. AID's had them for 8 years. There is a nonprofit center that judges how well-run federal agencies are. AID was ranked the third best run of all the federal agencies. It's not full of fraud and abuse. It's nonsense.
No,
It was a
and
lie. It
and
was a
that,
bold-faced lie when they started making these accusations.
well, and they knew they were
You
lying.
asked me why I went on the air. I listened to what they were saying. I was so infuriated by it. I went on 60 Minutes. You were there when I was being interviewed. I did 56 interviews on mostly TV, radio, some in other countries, BBC, the German radio, TV, and French and Japanese and Canadian, but mostly in the United States, defending AID and explaining what we did. And it's because I was so angry at it's not an exaggeration, it's a lie. They marched 56 people, senior career officers out of aid, fired them all the third day. And they said that they were being insubordinate. Those people worked for me when they were junior officers. They're not insubordinate. And they're not, the president said they're all communists. One of them, and I'm not going to mention names, she is from the holiness movement of a Pentecostal church that comes out of the third great evangelical awakening in the United States. I know her quite well. The notion that she said they're calling me a communist. I'm a conservative Christian. She's a career senior executive service. Another senior woman in the agency, she calls herself a pre-Vatican II Catholic. She wants the Latin Mass brought back. She likes chanting and all that, and she's very conservative theologically, and she's a senior officer. When they said everybody's a liberal, and there are liberals in it. Of course, there are. There are also conservatives at AID.
100%.
The head of the budget office, when I was a director, he's a career civil servant, was a Mormon. I don't know many Mormons who are communists.
And frankly, the ridiculous and insulting and derogatory language used against all of us aid workers. Let me tell you one of the reasons it irritates me so much beyond the obvious. When I first started in this work, and you remember this, I was 24 years old. The first real mentor I had was this guy. I'm not going to name the person or place or anything. I don't want a lot of details on this, but he fired someone for committing fraud overseas when he was running an aid program. And he got assassinated because of it the next day, left behind a bunch of kids and a big family, right? If there's so much fraud, waste, and abuse, why do we have those stories? Why do we have people doing that? Why do we have Americans risking their lives and losing their lives in many cases? So
I think we should be honoring them because I think they're heroes myself.
Same here. Looking forward, again, I imagine we haven't talked about this much because we've been mired in the rest of what's transpired. What do you think about the future of, what do you think the dismantling of our foreign aid system? There's a lot of other turmoil in other areas of country right now, and I think in the world. Specific to foreign aid, what do you think the future is going to look like? And what are the prospects of something being brought back?
Well, one, the opponents of the administration who support AID sort of didn't look carefully at what they actually cut. They cut 83% of the contracts and grants, but not 83% of the funding. They cut about 55% of the funding. They wanted to say it was high percentage to villainize the administration, which is easy to do, very easy to do, okay? And the administration exaggerated what they cut in order to pander to their constituency who don't care about foreign affairs. So the actual cuts are around 55, which is huge, okay? But the big damage to aid is not the cuts in the budget. We took cuts in the budget after the Vietnam War in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed. Why do we have to have a foreign aid program if there's no Soviet Union any longer? And we could have dealt with that. But what they did was they abolished the agency and fired 10,000 people with decades of experience. And the second thing they did is merge what was remaining of the aid program into the State Department. I was a diplomat for a time. I worked with diplomats. I think the State Department is the greatest foreign ministry in the whole world. But they are not a program management agency. They're not a development agency. If you run those programs out of state, they will not work. I can just tell you. The State Department is very slow moving because they don't want to make any mistakes that could lead to a war, nuclear exchange, or a catastrophe. So they're very careful. USAID emergency programs, they're very rapid. They move very rapidly. And the State Department always needs money for various programs around the world that are fast, that are very visible. They're very interested in visible programs. Well, the best programs sometimes are not visible. So I think by moving what was remaining of aid into state, you're going to destroy the program. We need an independent department that is part of the cabinet of the United States, that sits at cabinet meetings and National Security Council meetings, not part of the State Department, but a separate agency. And we have 12 different aid programs run all over the federal government, which doesn't make any sense. They confuse people. I go to countries, and the countries said, "Now, Andrew, you're telling me we need market reforms here, but I just talked to someone from the Treasury Department. Aren't you a part of the same government?" I said, "Yes, we are." And they're telling me to do the exact opposite. I said, I don't know why they're telling you that, because you need these reforms. And this goes on in the health area and all, and it's very confusing and embarrassing to the United States to have all of these programs spread out all over the United States government. I think we need one department. We abolished the AID 60 missions. A lot of the 50% of the staff of aid are not Americans. They're Ethiopians, they were Kenyans, they were Peruvians, they were Cambodians, they're from the countries. And most of them had advanced degrees. They were not drivers. They were
right.
A lot of them were in the health field or had medical degrees from American medical schools. And we did not pay them a lot of money because we paid them to basically what the wage scales were in the country. So you get a doctor with a degree from the Harvard Medical School for $30,000 a year. And that's a good deal in my view. All those people, many of them would go on to take jobs, run for office. The first woman president of Costa Rica, worked for aid for 10 years. She was an employee of AID, and she was the first woman president. And I might add, she was from a conservative party too. The first woman vice president ever elected in El Salvador was also from a conservative party. She worked for AID for 10 years, got her master's degree with an AID scholarship. The vice president of Ecuador. I was in Slavic Macedonia, not Greek Macedonia, just before 9/11, and I always used to meet with the local hires separately from the Americans just to see what they would say. And I said, "Have any of you ever thought of running for office?" And two guys raised their hand. He said, "We were just elected 2 weeks ago to Parliament or National Assembly in Macedonia. And we're going to quit tomorrow, but we wanted to keep our job at AID so we could meet with you." And what inspired them to run was they're running democracy programs before they ran. And they said AID is so trusted in the country and so well regarded that just being associated was enough to get us elected to Parliament. Wouldn't it be better to have presidents and prime ministers and finance ministers and NGO leaders and parliamentarians who worked for the United States government and AID than people who work for China, for example? Because what's happening now is China's taking our place around them.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And Russia in some cases.
And Russia.
I don't know what's worse.
Russia's much worse than China.
Is there anything else you wanted to?
Well, I could talk for several hours. I teach this
I know.
in my classes.
Thank you very much for talking with me more formally, officially, and tune in for episode 2.
Absolutely.
All right. That's a wrap for episode 1. Thank you for tuning in today, and please join us next week. I'll be sharing opportunities to engage more with our content in the weeks ahead, so stay tuned. And once again, please like, subscribe, and share, especially with any skeptics you might know. See you next week.